So we have a lot of questions from installers asking whether we can do this, we can do that, if we can run them in off-grid, if we can connect a generator, etc., etc. So I thought I would begin with this just to give you a bit of context of what you can and what you can't do with our inverters. So the first one is that you cannot connect the backup side of our inverters together in parallel. So if you're running some backup loads, you cannot connect the backup loads to both the inverters. So what you would need is to separate your backup loads and connect one circuit of backup loads to one inverter and one circuit of backup loads to the second inverter. So as you can see here, this backup load connected to both inverters will not work. The second one is that you cannot connect one single PV string or one string of panels to two or more inverters. So each inverter needs to be connected to its own PV array. This is a big one. Our inverters do not support off-grid systems. So when we're talking about traditional off-grid systems, 300, 400 kilometers away from the grid, etc., our inverters are not designed to work without a grid connection. It does have the UPS or the backup function, but it's not a typical traditional off-grid inverter where it will not work without a connection to the grid. So that's very, very important. I do receive a lot of questions, quite rightly. I receive a lot of questions regarding whether we could use our inverters in an off-grid situation, but the answer is no. So for every inverter, as you might recall from last week, we supply them with a smart meter. At this point in time, you cannot connect one smart meter to multiple hybrid inverters. So if you were to use multiple inverters, you would need to install one smart meter per inverter. But again, if you were with us last week, for the ET and the BT inverters, we do have an SEC 1000S data logger, which allows the paralleling of more than one or up to 10 ET inverters. And inside this SEC 1000S is actually a smart meter. So in this application, you can use one smart meter with multiple inverters. However, with the single phase inverters such as the ES and EM, at the moment, it is not possible. So if you're installing two hybrid inverters, most likely you'll have to install two separate smart meters because they will be working independently from each other. Another don't is you cannot connect one battery bank and spread it across multiple inverters. So every inverter needs to be connected to its own separate individual battery bank. We cannot connect a generator to the on-grid side of the inverter or the backup side of the inverter. So that's one thing you cannot do. Again, we have a approved battery statement list, which you can download from the GoodWe website. The batteries which are on this list are allowed to be connected to the inverter, but if you see if you come across any batteries, any very exotic batteries that are not on the list, please do not connect them to our inverter. One, it will not work properly, and two, it will probably void the warranty of the inverter. So stick to the batteries that are on the approved battery list. Another thing that we also get asked is whether the backup side can be connected to the grid, and the answer is no. Only the on-grid backup, only the on-grid output of the inverter can be connected to the grid side. So a lot of the images that I show in this presentation are taken from the manual. So I'm not showing you anything new, or I'm not showing you anything that's secret. So what you see here is what you can also find in the manual. So in terms of preliminary info, what you need to install, or before you install our hybrid inverters, have a read of the GoodWe installation manual. It's available on the internet, or it's also supplied in the package of the inverter. It's always good to read the manuals, some tips that you find in there. Also, what you should have on your smart devices is the copy of the PV Master app and also the SEMS monitoring app, which can be downloaded from the Google Play Store or the Apple Store. Of course, you have your requisite tool sets, insulation with up to 1000 volts DC or even higher, 1500 volts DC if possible. Also relevant multimeters, clamp meters, and digital multimeters as well, just to measure the voltages and the currents, etc. But this is the tools that you usually have in the vans or with you when you're installing the PV plants in any case. And also important personal protective equipment, also just to keep in mind of what your local safety or health and safety regulations stay when you're working on live or isolated electrical equipment. So we here at GoodWe, we want you to go back home safely to your family, all in one piece. So please be aware when you're working with electrical equipment. Some preliminary checks that you already probably do, just ensure that the inverter is installed as per the GoodWe installation manual. I'll take you through a few more slides there that gives you a bit more detail. Always check the polarity of the DC strings. However, we do have a reverse polarity protection on the inverter. So in case you do connect the positive of the array to the negative of the inverter will not blow up or it will not damage itself. It will actually not turn on. So you can easily check that with a multimeter that you have at hand. Also check the voltages of the PV strings to ensure that the DC voltage is above the operating, above the minimum startup voltage of the inverter, and also to ensure that you've connected the correct number of modules up on the roof. There have been instances where installers or the colleagues of installers have accidentally not connected one or two panels at the end of the strings. That stuff can happen, so just make sure that you test the string voltages. Also measuring the AC voltage at the output of the inverter or at the distribution boards to ensure that you have a stable 230, 235 volt voltage at the inverter, so that the inverter can synchronize and connect to the grid. Number 5 doesn't apply to the hybrid inverters. It only applies to the grid connect inverters, the XS and the STT-G2 range. And also, after you've done all the checks, then you can turn on the DC switch to power on the inverter. So these are a couple of things to check before you start powering the inverter, etc., etc.